Hello everyone, today we're going to do our tutorial on how to add a weapon to the definitive FPS kit. I'm going to do this with a completely new weapon, but let's start with the basics. Organizing the folders. Now that the folders have been created and properly organized, let's create our weapon. First, we'll create a blueprint that inherits from the base weapon. This way we don't need to copy all the logic for every new weapon. This is the weapon the player will use during gameplay. Later, we'll create the version used in the loadout creation and pickup menus. We'll come back here later to finish setting up the weapon blueprint. Now let's import the weapon mesh. I'll briefly go through the settings I use for the general import. All right, everything has been imported correctly. We'll come back here later to set up the attachment sockets. Now we need to create an animation blueprint for our weapon. Once it's created, we'll copy the entire base from the template AnimBP to the newly created AnimBP one for our weapon. With the AnimBP created, it can now be added to our weapon blueprint. However, don't forget that you still need to set up all the animations for this animation blueprint. Now let's start setting up our weapon. The first thing we need to do is replace the weapon mesh. Once that's done, we can replace the AnimBP with the correct one for this weapon. Now under class defaults, you'll configure all aspects of the weapon, such as all the animations, ammo count, fire rate, and everything the weapon does and how it behaves in game. I'll fill in a few sections just as an example. There's an important note for this part. You'll only need to adjust the position of the barrel and sight sockets once, specifically for the base weapon without any attachments. When you add attachments, they will be automatically adjusted. However, this can still be tweaked at runtime if a specific attachment requires it. Start and end pivot are related to the weapon's sway. The start pivot controls the inert part of the weapon, usually positioned near the front, which creates a more noticeable sway. The end pivot, on the other hand, helps to reduce that sway. When the weapon is moving a lot, the pivot gradually shifts from the start to the end, which is usually positioned at the stock or grip. This allows for much better control over the weapon's sway. Now let's move on to another important part, creating the attachment sockets. Select the bone where you want to create the socket, then name it however you prefer. Just keep in mind that you'll be using these socket names later. You can also add a preview mesh to make it easier to visualize the final result. The sockets I'm setting up now are for the weapon's core components. They can still be adjusted later, but these will serve as the base model. After this, we'll create the sockets for additional attachments like sights, muzzles, lasers, and more. There's one more socket that you need to create and one name it a bit UI. This HIT is responsible for the dynamic UI, which can be enabled in the menu. You can place it wherever you prefer, just create it on the bone that makes the most sense to you. I usually place it on the weapon's body, but I've also placed it on the magazine or the slide for some weapons. With that configured, we won't need to come back here. Another very important part is creating the pickup version of our weapon. It's responsible for customization in the main menu, selection in the main menu, and for being dropped or equipped during gameplay. First, let's set up the weapon mesh. Once it's configured, I'll briefly go over the settings. Here we have all the necessary configurations to ensure everything works correctly. After adjusting the mesh and its position, we can move on to the next setting, the default attachment list for the weapon. Only include components from the weapon's base version in this list. In this list, there are a few settings. Bone attach, the name of the socket where the attachment will be placed. SM attachment, the mesh used for this specific attachment. With the current settings, we can already test the weapon. However, it hasn't been added to the selection menu in the main menu yet. So for now, let's test it by picking it up directly from the ground. Let's drag our blueprint onto the map. That's it. Now you just have to test and make sure everything is set up correctly. Yes, everything is working perfectly. We're going to add the new weapon to the main menu. It's a lot easier than you think. All we need to do is go to the widget blueprint, weapon operator custom, and in the weapon list, add a button with the settings for our weapon. About 98% of the settings are purely visual. What really matters are two key properties. Weapon class refers to the weapon pickup blueprint. Weapon class menu defines which menu category the weapon belongs to. For example, assault rifle is 0, SMG is 1, shotguns is 2, and so on. And don't forget to check the change weapon option. It's responsible for distinguishing this button from the one used to configure the weapon in the gunsmith. And, well, that's it. The weapon should now appear in the main menu, but before we test it, let's set up the attachments so they show up in the gunsmith. Remember when we set up the attachments earlier? I mentioned we'd come back here to add the sections of the weapon that can be customized in the gunsmith. Once you've configured all the sockets on the weapon, take note of the names you gave each one and add to the list all the attachments you want, organized by category. For example, in the holographic sights category, you'll add all compatible attachments for that weapon. Important, always leave the first slot empty, or at least include an empty option, so it can act as the no attachment choice. However, for things like magazines or similar components, don't leave an empty space unless that's your intention. Who knows, maybe that's exactly what you want. Well, that's it. You can now select the weapon through the gunsmith menu. Everything you configure here will be saved to your loadout, and you'll be able to use the weapon normally. Have fun. There will be more tutorials about this project, so don't worry if your question wasn't covered in this video. The next tutorial will cover how to set up the changes that attachments make to the weapon. Thank you all, and see you soon.